Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. You know, we love to break down tricky ABA concepts and give you guys some real-world stuff you can actually use. And today, well, we're tackling one that tends to make people kind of nervous. It's positive punishment.
Yeah, punishment. It's a word that can definitely spark some debate.
For sure. But in ABA, it has a very specific meaning, and that's what our deep dive is all about today. So no worries, we're not talking about anything harsh or cruel. It's all about understanding how consequences can shape behavior.
Exactly. And today we're zeroing in on Chapter 18 of Behavior Modification Principles and Procedures to unpack all the ins and outs of positive punishment.
Love it. So before we get too deep, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly is positive punishment in the context of ABA?
Well, in ABA, punishment simply means anything that decreases a behavior. And positive means we're adding something after the behavior happens.
Got it. So it's not about being positive in the sense of something good. It's about adding something to the situation.
Precisely. So positive punishment means we're adding something immediately after a behavior to make it less likely to happen again. Think of it like this. You touch a hot stove, you get burned. You're probably not going to touch that stove again.
Makes sense. The burn is the positive punisher because it was added to the situation and decreased the chances of you touching the stove again.
Yeah.
I guess our everyday lives are full of these little positive punishers, huh?
Absolutely. They're everywhere. But the key is to understand how to use this concept effectively and ethically in ABA.
Right, which is exactly why we're here. So the chapter breaks down positive punishment into two main categories: the application of aversive activities and the application of aversive stimulation. Let's start with aversive activities. What are we talking about here?
Well, aversive activities are things people tend to avoid. You know, chores, homework, certain exercises, things we usually wouldn't choose to do.
Oh, okay. So low probability behaviors.
Exactly. And in ABA, we can use those as a consequence for a behavior we're trying to decrease.
So if a kid's always interrupting in class, the teacher might give them an extra chore, like cleaning the chalkboard, as a consequence.
Right. And that extra chore, the aversive activity, might make the child less likely to interrupt again. Actually, the chapter uses this great example of a little girl named Allison. She loved to scribble on the walls.
Ah, the classic wall scribbling phase. Every parent's dream.
Right. So her dad decided that instead of just having her clean the wall she scribbled on, he'd make her clean an extra wall as well.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was adding an extra chore as a consequence to try and stop the scribbling.
Yeah. And it actually ties into the Premack principle. You know, the idea that a high probability behavior, something they love to do, like scribbling on the walls, can be reduced by making it contingent on a low probability behavior, something they don't like to do, like cleaning extra walls.
Right. So we're basically using something they don't like to do to decrease the likelihood of them doing something they do like to do. Pretty clever.
It's all about understanding how to manipulate those probabilities. Now the chapter goes on to describe different types of aversive activities used in ABA.
Okay, spill the tea. I'm all ears. What are some of these aversive activities?
Well, one is positive practice. This is where you have the person practice the correct behavior over and over again. The book gives the example of this boy, Simon, who kept wetting the bed. So every time he had an accident, his mom had him practice getting out of bed and going to the bathroom over and over.
Oh, man. Talk about a sleep disruption.
Yeah.
But I guess the repetition is supposed to help him learn the right behavior.
Exactly. Another type is restitution. It's not just about fixing the problem, but restoring the environment to an even better state than before the behavior happened.
So going above and beyond to make amends.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. They give an example of a student who knocked over a desk in detention. Instead of just fixing his own desk, the teacher had him straighten up all the desks in the classroom.
Okay, so taking responsibility plus some makes sense. What else is on the list?
Well, there's contingent exercise. This involves physical activity that's not related to the problem behavior. The example they use is a boy named Chen who loved to swear. Every time he swore, his dad made him wash the windows.
So it's not directly connected to the swearing, but it's still something he wants to avoid. Pretty smart.
And it actually led to a pretty significant decrease in his swearing. Then we have guided compliance. This is where you physically guide someone through a requested activity if they're refusing to do it.
Ah, I can see this being helpful for little kids who are having tantrums or refusing to pick up their toys.
Exactly. You're providing that physical prompt to help them complete the task. And over time, they might learn to do it on their own. Then there's physical restraint. This is where you temporarily restrict someone's movement as a consequence for a problem behavior.
Okay, this one sounds a bit more intense. I'm guessing it's only used in very specific situations.
You got it. It's definitely the most controversial and should only be used in extreme cases with tons of ethical considerations. The book uses the example of a teacher holding down the arms of a student who was hitting other children. But it's important to stress that this should only be done by highly trained professionals and with extreme caution.
Makes sense. So we've covered positive practice, restitution, contingent, exercise, guided compliance, and physical restraint. That's a lot of ground covered. But before we move on, I think it's super important to remember that all of these procedures are meant to be used ethically and with the individual's well-being in mind.
Couldn't agree more. And we'll definitely be discussing those ethical considerations in more detail later in our deep dive.
Sounds good. So let's shift gears now and explore the other side of the coin, the application of aversive stimulation.
Let's do it. All right, so we've talked about aversive activities where you add an unwanted task or activity to decrease a behavior. Now let's move on to aversive stimulation. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, what makes that different?
Well, instead of adding a task, you're adding a sensory stimulus that the individual finds unpleasant.
Okay, so things like a loud noise or a bad smell or even like a quick spray of water.
Yep, exactly. And those are just a few examples. The key here is that it's a sensory experience that the person finds aversive.
I see. But doesn't that make it kind of subjective? I mean, what one person finds aversive, another person might not even notice, right?
We're absolutely right. What's aversive for one person might not be aversive for another. That's why it's so important to individualize these interventions and really figure out what's truly aversive for that specific person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So what are some examples of aversive stimuli that are actually used in ABA?
Well, the chapter mentions a few, and some are definitely more intense than others. One example is electric shock.
Whoa.
Okay.
That sounds pretty intense.
I know it sounds scary, but it's important to understand that this is typically only used in very specific and extreme situations.
Like for people who engage in severe self-injurious behavior.
Exactly. And the book actually talks about the SIPIS device, which is designed to deliver a brief controlled electric shock if a person engages in self-injurious behavior like headbanging.
So basically, it's a last resort if other interventions haven't worked and the behavior is extremely dangerous.
Right. It's not something that anyone takes lightly. And it requires lots of ethical oversight, medical supervision, and constant data collection, to make sure everything is being done safely and appropriately.
Makes sense. So that's kind of the extreme end of the spectrum. What about some less intense aversive stimuli? What are some examples of those?
Sure. Well, there are things like unpleasant smells, like aromatic ammonia, which is often used to try and quickly interrupt a dangerous behavior, or a brief spray of water mist in the face, which can be kind of startling and help to stop the behavior.
I could see how those would be aversive to some people. What about reprimands? I think the chapter mentioned that as an example.
Right. A firm reprimand, especially if it's delivered with eye contact, can be aversive for some people, especially if it's paired with losing something they find reinforcing.
So like if a kid is playing video games and starts yelling at their sibling, the parent might give them a firm reprimand and take away the video game for a bit.
Exactly. So it's not just the words themselves, it's the whole context and the individual's learning history that determines whether something is actually aversive.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it really is all about understanding the individual and what's going to be effective for them. So I guess even when we're talking about less intense aversive stimuli, positive punishment should still be a last resort, right?
You got it. The chapter really stresses this point. Before even thinking about punishment, we need to try everything else first.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, first and foremost, we need to try reinforcement strategies. What can we do to reinforce the positive behaviors that we want to see? Can we change the environment to make those behaviors more likely to happen?
So it's about being proactive and focusing on what we want to see instead of just reacting to the stuff we don't want to see.
Exactly. And then we also need to think about antecedent manipulations. Can we change or remove any triggers in the environment that might be causing the problem behavior in the first place?
Like if a child always has a tantrum when they're hungry, maybe we could make sure they have a snack before we go to the store.
That's a great example. It's all about being proactive and setting the individual up for success. And only when these less intrusive strategies have been tried and haven't worked, or when the behavior is really dangerous, would we even consider using punishment procedures?
So it's like punishment is our backup plan, not our go-to strategy.
Exactly. It's the last tool in the toolbox, not the first one we reach for.
Exactly. because it's a powerful tool and we got to make sure we're using it ethically and responsibly.
Yeah.
But the chapter does highlight some cases where it can be really effective.
Oh, yeah, definitely. When it's done right and thoughtfully, it can really make a difference.
So let's get into those case studies. I want to see how these concepts play out in real life.
Okay, so there's this case about Donna, a 17-year-old girl with intellectual disabilities. She was engaging in severe head-hitting behavior, and it was causing her serious harm.
Oh, wow. That's tough. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for her and everyone involved.
Oh, yeah, it was a really tough situation. They tried a bunch of different interventions, but nothing seemed to work.
And then they decided to try the SIPIS device, right?
Right. But it's important to remember that this was after trying tons of other stuff. And they made sure there was a ton of ethical review before moving forward with it.
Makes sense. So what happened when they started using the SIPIS device?
The results were pretty amazing. Donna's head hitting decreased almost immediately, and it basically started at 0.
Wow, that's incredible. So it really does show how effective this kind of intervention can be in certain situations.
It does, but again, it also emphasizes how important it is to do careful assessments, make ethical decisions, and monitor everything super closely.
Right, it's not something you just jump into without careful planning.
Exactly. Okay, so let's move on to another case. This one involves contingent exercise. Remember Chen, the guy who couldn't stop swearing?
Yeah, what happened with him?
Well, his dad decided to have him wash the windows every time he swore. It wasn't about punishing him in the traditional sense, but more about giving him a consequence that was directly related to the behavior and that he wanted to avoid.
So did it work? Did Chen finally clean up his act?
He did. The chapter says that his swearing decreased significantly almost as soon as they started the intervention.
That's awesome. It just shows how creative we can be with these interventions. This doesn't have to be some textbook punishment. It can be something tailored to the individual and their environment.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the goal is to find the least restrictive and least aversive method that's actually going to work.
Okay, there's one more case study I wanted to talk about. The chapter mentions something called facial screening. What is that?
Oh, yeah. Facial screening is a less intrusive type of aversive stimulation. Sometimes it's used to address self-injurious behaviors like head hitting or face scratching.
Okay, so how does it actually work?
So in the study, they talked about there were 3 girls with intellectual disabilities who were engaging in these behaviors. Each girl wore a terry cloth bib, and when they would start hitting themselves or scratching their faces, the experimenter would pull the bib up over their face for a few seconds.
So it's not painful, but it's definitely disruptive.
Exactly. And it actually worked really well. The self-injurious behaviors decreased a lot for all 3 girls.
That's amazing, how such a simple intervention can have such a big impact.
It is. And it shows that positive punishment doesn't have to be harsh or extreme. Sometimes a short, disruptive consequence is all it takes to make a change.
Well, I think these case studies really show how positive punishment, when used ethically and appropriately, can be a powerful tool to help people overcome challenging behaviors.
Absolutely. It's not about being mean or punitive. It's about helping people live better lives.
And that's what ABA is all about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into positive punishment. We hope you found it helpful and insightful. Don't forget to check out Chapter 18 of Behavior Modification Principles and Procedures for a closer look at this topic.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of ABA.